They took Earth's colony ships. Humanity didn't file a complaint. It sent a Dreadnought Armada the signal that 14 ships were gone came in at 3:17 on a Tuesday. No distress calls. No wreckage. Just gone from the transit lane, the way cargo goes missing when someone with a bigger stamp decides it belongs to them now. The colony ships had been 3 days out of the tail-end corridor, full holds and full families, when the Karath patrol intercepted them. 6,211 people, seed stock, medical units, the kind of equipment you only pack when you are not planning to come back. The patrol cited 17 transit codes. Every code was real. Not one had ever been shared with a species Karath had never formally spoken to. The adjutant brought the file to High Fleet Sovereign Reth Vonkor on a standard summary sheet, 4 pages reduced to 3 lines. He pressed his thumb to the approval field without looking up from the map he was reading. The 14 ships were redirected to Processing Station Verath 7. The families were logged as cargo. Within the hour, the broadcast went out on open conclave frequencies. They are not colonists, they are squatters. The universe does not negotiate with squatters. No threat attached. No terms, no conditions, no invitation to respond. The statement had the tone of a man correcting a filing error, patient, final, mildly irritated that anyone had let it get this far. The conclave received it on 47 channels. So did every ship in 12 systems. So did the Terran Strategic Council in a meeting room on Earth that had not yet been adjourned, watching the translation scroll across a screen nobody had expected to need. Vonkor did not think about humanity again that day. He had 91 species under sovereignty classification. He had 6,000 years of doctrine and 300 years of personal command. He had 847 warships and a procurement directorate that ran the numbers on everything from fuel to labor contracts, all graded in descending order of auditable relevance. Humanity had come back as Grade 4, pre-sovereign developmental. No conclave standing. No recognized party status. No column that required monitoring. He moved to the next item on his agenda. The conclave's response to the Terran inquiry arrived 9 days later. It was a form letter. It cited Grade 4 status 3 times and the absence of recognized party standing twice. The process for appealing a Grade 4 classification required conclave standing. Achieving conclave standing required a recognized petition. Filing a recognized petition required existing standing. The form letter did not acknowledge the irony. The Terran Council's contact, a man named Adami who had spent 4 years in the conclave's outer offices, understanding exactly how its bureaucracy worked, read the letter twice. He set it on the table. He did not reach for the next form. The galaxy was watching for what humanity would do. There were, in political terms, 3 available moves. A protest fleet, they had nothing that counted as one. A conclave petition, the door was locked with its own key. A negotiation, you negotiate with someone who is already in the room with you, and humanity was not in the room. It was in a filing cabinet labeled Grade 4, pre-sovereign developmental, and the cabinet was in a drawer marked no further action required. What the galaxy got instead was quiet. Not the quiet of a species that has accepted its situation. The galaxy does not always know the difference, which is, in some ways, the point. Adami's contact report to the Terran Strategic Council was 4 sentences long. He noted the conclave's response, the structure of its appeals process, and the effective status of the file. His last sentence read, "The form letter is included as an appendix. I do not believe a second inquiry is indicated." The report was received. The Council read it. The Council did not issue a second inquiry. Somewhere in a building that did not appear on any Terran city planning record, a woman named Yale Okonkwo received a separate report the same morning. She was 57 years old. She had been director of quiet operations for 11 years, though the title appeared on no org chart anyone could access. She read Adami's 4 sentences, set the page down, and looked at the thing on her office wall. The broadcast, framed. The translation printed below the original frequency capture in small type. They are not colonists, they are squatters. The universe does not negotiate with squatters. She had ordered it framed the same week it came in. Her assistant had thought it was grief or anger. It was neither. She had a word for what it was. She used it the one time someone asked, and the word was useful. "It tells us exactly what they audit," she said, "and what they don't." Project Stillwater had been running for 4 years at that point. The seizure had not triggered it. The seizure had confirmed the assumption it was already built against. The assumption was this: a 6,000-year empire that outsources drive core labor to the cheapest certified foundry and audits nothing classified grade 4 or below is an empire that will install whatever its subcontractors put inside the specs. You do not need to hide from an organization that has already decided before looking that you are not worth the look. The engineers were already in the pipeline. The bids had already been submitted. Okonkwo had known for 4 years that the contract would be awarded because the price was 23% below every Karath competitor, and the certifications would pass every inspection, and no Karath auditor was going to read past the price and the stamp on a grade 4 vendor manifest. She picked up the framed broadcast. She did not rehang it. She set it flat on the desk, face up, where she would see it every morning when she sat down. Then she turned to the progress report from Foundry System 1, where the first rotation of engineers had just passed their 6-month review and got back to work. Nothing about humanity's silence looked like anything. That was the problem with silence. It had no shape you could measure. The conclave moved to other items. Vonkor ran his fleet on its standard cycles. The 6,211 colonists at Processing Station Vereth 7 were logged, processed, and assigned temporary residential codes because even grade 4 detainees required paperwork. At Foundry System 1, a human engineer named Priya finished her shift, filed a maintenance log in passable Karath standard, and went to eat in the mess hall with 2 Karath technicians she had worked alongside for 8 months. She ordered something she could not identify from the menu board and ate it anyway. The technicians showed her a card game she did not win. Her maintenance log, filed that evening under the standard subcontractor header, included the phrase drive alignment calibration, completed, no anomalies. This was accurate in every sense the Karath diagnostic system was capable of checking. 3 levels below the calibration registers, below the threshold of any sweep the Karath Procurement Directorate had ever run on a grade 4 subcontractor's work. A dormant node sat in the deepest layer of the ship's drive core architecture and waited. It would wait as long as it needed to. The origin of Project Stillwater was not the seizure. It was older than that. Okonkwo had been watching Karath's procurement doctrine for 6 years before Vonkor ever heard the word Talon, and what she saw was not a threat to be countered. It was a structure to be read. The Karath sovereignty ran on classification. Everything in the observable galaxy was graded, filed, and acted upon in descending order of auditable relevance. Grade 1 through Grade 3 species got diplomatic attaches and fleet assessments and trade negotiations. Grade 4 and below got a form code and a registry and a procurement window, because even underdeveloped worlds had raw materials and cheap labor, and the sovereignty had always known how to use both. The procurement window was the thing Okonkwo had circled. A Grade 4 vendor who submitted correct certifications and priced below the Karath competitors would be awarded a contract. The contract would be logged, inspected at delivery, and archived. No Karath auditor would revisit a Grade 4 subcontractor's work once the paperwork cleared, because the classification already told them what they would find: nothing worth finding. The filing system was the blindfold, and the sovereignty had been wearing it for 6,000 years without incident, because no species had ever thought to use it as a door. 4 years before the Talon seizure, Okonkwo had written a 20-page internal document. It had one question at the top: if the certification passes and the price is right, what can we put inside the specs? The document's appendix listed drive core architecture specifications for every class of Karath warship whose maintenance records had leaked into conclave trade filings over the prior decade. The appendix was 31 pages long. She called the project Stillwater, not because of stillness exactly, because of what water does when it has been still long enough in the right place under the right pressure. It does not announce itself. The consortium took 14 months to build the cover structure, a licensed fabrication entity with registered certifications across 3 trade territories, bid history going back 8 years, references from 2 Karath-adjacent systems who had never heard of Yale Okonkwo. The price for drive core calibration work across Karath's 3 primary foundry systems came in at 23% below every Karath competitor, which was not an accident. It was a calculation. High enough to look real, low enough to be irresistible. The Procurement Directorate reviewed the bid on a Wednesday. It was awarded on Friday. The approval officer's name was Teln Havar, 11 years into a quiet career, and he initialed the contract on page 1 and page 7 without reading pages 2 through 6, because pages 2 through 6 contained only the technical specifications, and those were the engineer's business. He filed it under Grade 4, approved, routine. He moved to the next item. He was good at his job. The first rotation of engineers arrived at Karath Foundry System 4 months later. 11 people. All of them had language training, enough Karath standard to order lunch, file a maintenance log, ask where the nearest tool cache was. They wore the same gray work suits as every other certified subcontractor in the yard. They carried the same equipment cases. One thing did not appear on any equipment manifest. It was small enough to hold in a cupped hand. It looked, to anyone trained on Karath diagnostic systems, exactly like a calibration shim, a passive spacer used to true up the alignment between drive registers. Karath diagnostic sweeps were not calibrated to look below the calibration layer. Nobody had ever needed to look below the calibration layer before. The node required 4 hours to install correctly on a running drive core by someone who knew where to put it. The installation produced no heat signature, no power draw, no anomaly on any system the Karath engineers monitored. When it was done, the drive core functioned perfectly. Every metric was nominal. Every audit would confirm this because the audit was measuring the calibration layer and the node was not in the calibration layer. It was in the layer below. The first ship took 3 weeks. Priya's team moved on to the second, then the third. The work was slow in the way that anything real is slow. Engineers rotated on 6-month cycles, so no single face became too familiar in any single yard. The rotation schedule lived in the building that did not exist, managed by a woman named Fatu who had spent her previous career in logistics, and who maintained the schedule in a ledger she updated by hand because a handwritten ledger could not be accessed remotely. Some of the engineers had families. The families were told they were working long-haul fabrication contracts in the outer trade systems, which was accurate in the way that a map is accurate when it shows you the roads but not what is buried under them. The engineers knew why the cover had to hold. They did not discuss it because there was nothing to discuss. The work was the work. The youngest of them was a man named Dario, 24 at the start of his first rotation. He spent 6 months at Foundry System 2, working alongside a Karath technician named Velashan who was 40 years older and deeply bored by drive calibration, and who taught Dario 3 Karath card games and the correct word for the specific kind of annoyance you feel when a diagnostic system gives you a result you already knew it was going to give you. Dario thought the word was untranslatable. He used it anyway. He installed 9 nodes during that rotation. He filed 9 maintenance logs. The logs said, drive alignment calibration, completed, no anomalies. He went home, someone else went back. Year 3, Year 5, Year 7. The count accumulated the way things accumulate when nobody is watching, not all at once, not with any visible moment of completion, but steadily the way a tide comes in. Okonkwo tracked it in a second ledger. She updated it every time a rotation confirmed. She kept the ledger in the building that did not exist, and she did not number the pages. By Year 7, the count was 421 nodes installed and confirmed live across the first 2 Foundry systems. The flagship had not yet been touched. The KSV Eternal Doctrine was 14 kilometers of Karath engineering, the largest warship in the Sovereignty Fleet, Vongkor's command vessel for 22 years. Its drive core maintenance was contracted separately from the Foundry systems, handled by a specialist team that ran a full inspection cycle every 30 months. The inspection team was Karath, not subcontracted. Their work was audited at Grade 1 level, which meant it was actually audited. Getting inside the Eternal Doctrine required a different approach. It required the Sovereignty to decide, on its own initiative, that the Foundry subcontractors who had passed every audit for 7 years were the logical choice to handle an overflow maintenance backlog on the secondary drive systems during the flagship's scheduled refit. It took Okonkwo's team 9 months to engineer the circumstance that caused the procurement directorate to reach that conclusion without being pushed. A subcontractor pricing error on the primary Grade 1 maintenance team. A well-placed scheduling conflict. A certification lapse in a competitor's paperwork that happened, coincidentally, to open at the precise moment the refit was being tendered. None of it was visible as a plan. That was the point. The refit tender went out. The consortium's bid came in. Telnhavar, still in his quiet career, now 13 years in, initialed page 1 and page 7. The node went into the Eternal Doctrine's drive core on a Thursday afternoon, installed by a woman named Sina who had been on her 4th rotation, and who had never met Okonkwo, and who filed her maintenance log in Karath, standard without errors, and went to eat her dinner. She did not know she had just completed the set. Okonkwo learned about it 12 days later when the confirmation report came through the channel she had set up for exactly this purpose. She read the confirmation twice. She set the paper down. She did not celebrate. She picked up her coffee, already cold, the way it usually was by the time she got to it, took a drink, set the cup back down. She looked at the framed broadcast on her desk. Then she opened the second ledger to the current page. 847 nodes. All of them live, all of them undetected, all of them sitting in the deepest layer of 847 Karath warships, waiting for a single signal on a frequency the sovereignty's sensors were not calibrated to find, because nobody had ever needed to look for it before. She did not know exactly when she would send the signal. She knew what she was waiting for, the moment the terms she intended to deliver would be self-enforcing without a single shot. That required Vongkor on the bridge of the Eternal Doctrine when the lights went out. It required him to do the math himself, in real time, with no room to question the calculation. She closed the ledger, she went home. She would come back in the morning. There was still the matter of the 6,211 colonists at Verath 7, still logged as cargo, still waiting in temporary residential codes in a system none of them had asked to be in. 4 years now. Longer than some of their children had been alive. She had not forgotten about the colonists. Stillwater was for the colonists. Everything had always been for the colonists. She simply understood, in a way that was difficult to explain to people who had not spent 13 years building something in a building that did not exist, that the kind of help that lasts is not the kind you send in angry and fast. It is the kind you send after you have made certain it will work. On the Eternal Doctrine, a Karath maintenance technician named Veloshin, not the same Veloshin who had taught Dario the card games, but a different technician with the same first name, which was common in the Karath fleet, ran the ship's quarterly drive diagnostic on a schedule that had not varied in 6 years. Every system returned nominal. Every calibration register read clean. Veloshin filed the report, initialed it at the bottom, and sent it up the chain to Vongkor's adjutant, who summarized it in 2 lines and placed it in the weekly review packet. Vongkor did not read the weekly review packet. He received the summary of the summary, which confirmed that fleet readiness was at standard. It was at standard. He approved the summary with a thumbprint and moved to the next item. In his own manifests, the procurement records his directorate maintained as a matter of sovereignty doctrine, the same manifests the conclave could subpoena, the same manifests that were the legal record of every contract his fleet had ever executed. There was an entry filed under Grade 4, approved, routine, that read, Drive Alignment Calibration Subcontractors, Uncertified Species, Grade 4, Irrelevant. It was not hidden, it was not encrypted. It was in the manifest exactly where Telnhavar had filed it 11 years ago, and it had not been touched since. The line he had never read was the line that described his own architecture. The confirmation came on a Thursday. Not the confirmation that the nodes were live. Okonkwo had that already. This was a different kind of confirmation. A Karath fleet movement notice filed with the Conclave's open registry, the sort of document nobody read because it contained only standard scheduling data, the kind of thing an organization with 6,000 years of uncontested routine files without thinking. High Fleet Sovereign Reth Vongkor would be aboard the KSV Eternal Doctrine for a standard command review. 14 days, beginning the following Tuesday. Okonkwo read the filing once. She put it in a drawer. She went home and slept 8 hours, which was unusual for her. She came back the next morning, opened the drawer, read the filing again, and closed it. She made a note in the second ledger, the one without page numbers, and set the date. Not the first Tuesday. The 6th day of the review window. She wanted him settled in. She wanted him there because it was routine, because he had approved the weekly summary and eaten his dinner and run his standard command checks and was, by every measure available to him, on top of his fleet and in command of his situation. She wanted him confident. Tuesday came, Wednesday, Thursday. She worked. She received updates from Fadu, who confirmed that the rotation schedules were clean, that no engineers were currently in any Karath system, that the extraction window was clear. She reviewed the three terms one more time, flat 90 seconds, no room for a counter. She confirmed the trigger protocol. The trigger was simple. If the terms were not met in 60 hours, a technical file, the complete Stillwater documentation, every node location, every maintenance log, every contract record would transmit automatically to the Conclave's open record. Not as an accusation, as a matter of public fact. Every species in the Conclave would be able to read in the Sovereignty's own procurement manifests exactly what 847 of their warships contained. She did not need to threaten. The mathematics were self-explanatory. She set the transmission for 300 on the 6th day. She did not sleep that night, but not from nerves. She had a long list of other things that needed attention, and she worked through them until 2:45, at which point she set the work aside, made herself a cup of tea she would not drink, and sat down. At 300 exactly, she transmitted the authorization code. No weapon, no broadcast, no warning. One signal, on a frequency, the Sovereignty's monitoring systems were not calibrated to find, sent from a building that did not exist, addressed to 847 locations simultaneously. The code arrived in the drive core architecture of every warship in the Karath First Fleet, in the precise layer below the calibration registers, in the nodes that had been waiting, some of them for 11 years, some for 3, some for 18 months, and the nodes did the one thing they were designed to do. They assumed priority control of the drive systems. The drives did not fail. They did not spark or overheat or throw any diagnostic flag. They simply stopped answering to the Karath command protocols. Stopped cleanly the way a door stops answering to a key it no longer recognizes. On 847 warships simultaneously, every drive core indicator went dark. On the bridge of the KSV Eternal Doctrine, Vonkor's morning had been unremarkable. He had reviewed the fleet readiness summary, which was at standard, and approved it with a thumbprint. He had received a report on a minor scheduling conflict in the Second Fleet's patrol rotation and delegated its resolution to the appropriate adjutant. He had a cup of something hot that the Karath had been drinking for longer than most species had had writing, and it was good, and he finished it. He was reading a strategic assessment of a Grade 3 system, 2 sectors over when the sound changed. Not an alarm. The alarms were on. The ship was fine. What changed was the background tone of the drive systems, the constant, bone-deep hum that anyone who had spent 300 years on warships learned to hear the way they heard their own heartbeat, felt rather than registered, and it went quiet. Vonkor looked up. His chief engineer had already turned from her console. She was looking at her displays with the particular stillness of someone who has just seen a result she has not yet decided how to report. "Sovereign," she said, "I need you to look at this." All 847 ships in the First Fleet had returned the same reading simultaneously. The drives were not damaged. Every structural diagnostic was clean. Every system indicator showed nominal, but they were not responding to Karath command protocols. The diagnostic system had no fault to return because there was no fault. The drives were simply no longer answering. Vonkor set down the strategic assessment. He looked at the display. He had been a fleet commander for 300 years. He knew what battle damage looked like, what a cascade failure looked like, what a power routing error looked like. He knew what a cyber attack looked like, what a targeted weapon looked like, what a systems intrusion looked like. This did not look like any of them. This looked like nothing he had a category for. He was still forming the next question, the one that would have been where is it coming from when the screens changed. The command screens of the KSV Eternal Doctrine were sealed. This was not a security feature in the way that a lock is a security feature. It was a structural fact of how the Karath designed their bridge systems. The command interface ran on an internal architecture that had no external access point, because you could not access something that was not connected to anything outside itself. It was how the Sovereignty had always built its flagships. It had always been sufficient. The screens illuminated. Not the main display, not the public bridge screens. The command screens, the sealed internal interface, the one that by the logic of its own construction could not receive an external signal. Vonkor looked at the face on his command screen. A human face. A woman, somewhere in her late middle years, with the expression of someone who had already finished what she was about to say, and was choosing her words out of courtesy rather than effort. She did not introduce herself. She did not need to. "I will be brief," she said in Karath standard. Her accent was not perfect. It was good enough. "You awarded a drive core calibration contract 11 years ago to a Grade 4 vendor consortium. Your certification records list the work as routine subcontractor maintenance. Your procurement manifests describe the workers as, and I am quoting your own filing, uncertified species, Grade 4, irrelevant." She paused for a moment. On 847 other bridges, 847 other command screens were showing the same face. Those workers installed a command bridge interface node in the deepest layer of every drive core your fleet maintenance schedule touched over the course of the contract. All of them are currently active. This is why your drives are not responding. Voncor's chief engineer had gone very still. 3 terms, Okonkwo said. The 14 colony ships returned undamaged. The 6,211 colonists released and transported home. Formal conclave acknowledgement of human transit rights in the Talon corridor, registered in the sovereignty's own filing. She let those 3 things sit for a moment. "You have 60 hours. If the terms are not met, the complete documentation for this project, every contract record, every node location, every maintenance log, filed in the sovereignty's own procurement system under your own approval signature, transmits automatically to the conclave's open record. Every party with conclave standing will be able to read, in your own paperwork, what your fleet contains." Another pause, short. "I would like you to consider something. The workers who built this were on your stations for 11 years. They ate in your mess halls. They learned your language. They passed every audit you ran. They were not hiding. You simply decided before you looked that they were not worth looking at." She looked at him, or through him, through the screen, with the calm of someone who has already done the hard part and is now merely delivering the result. "That was your error, not ours." The screen went dark. Voncor's bridge was quiet in a way that bridges are not quiet. Not the quiet of a rest period or a routine watch, but the quiet of people who have just heard something that requires them to revise a significant number of prior assumptions before they can form a useful response. The chief engineer was the first to speak. She said in a voice that was almost entirely steady, "Sovereign, the diagnostic is showing the same result on all fleet vessels. I cannot tell you where the fault is because the diagnostic system has no category for it. There is no fault. The drives are simply not responding." She was giving him the professional version of what he already understood. She was doing her job. He was grateful for it, in the way you are grateful for the ordinary when the ordinary is all that is left to stand on. Voncor looked at the dark screen for a long moment. He was a methodical man. He had run every variable in the matter of humanity 4 years ago. He had checked the military column, the diplomatic column, the threat assessment column. He had found nothing because humanity was not in those columns. He had stopped there because in 6,000 years of sovereignty doctrine, the columns had always been sufficient. He had not checked the procurement column. He had not checked the column that listed the contractors who had been inside his ships for 11 years, eating in his mess halls, filing his maintenance logs, stamping their work as Grade 4, irrelevant. The variable he had left out of the math was the one that had been doing the math beside him the whole time. There was nothing to do with the silence except work. Voncor did not issue orders that night. Not because he had decided to comply, that decision came later in the clear arithmetic of the following morning, but because he could not yet form the orders that would have been the alternative. A distress signal to the conclave, and then what? He would have to say that 847 of his warships had been compromised by a Grade 4 vendor's subcontract work his own procurement directorate had approved and archived and never looked at again. He would have to say that the compromised architecture had been installed under his own manifests, filed under his own approval signatures, described in his own legal record as irrelevant. He would have to say that the species responsible had then offered to fix it, in exchange for 3 specific things, and had given him 60 hours. A military response? Against what? The nodes were inside his ships. There was nothing to target that he was not also targeting himself. A counter-negotiation, offering what? He had already understood in the first minutes after the screen went dark that Okonkwo was not waiting to negotiate. She had not left a channel open. She had stated the terms and the trigger and the timeline and then closed the connection because there was nothing to discuss. Either the terms were met or the file went to the conclave, and every party with standing could read, in the sovereignty's own handwriting, what 847 warships contained. The terms were three. They were not unreasonable. That was, in its own way, the most uncomfortable part. He had his adjutant begin drafting the conclave notification before the first watch ended. The work of compliance, it turned out, was mostly administrative. The 14 ships were in an impound bay at Verath 7. They had been there for 13 years. Every cargo manifest had been catalogued at intake: the seed stock, the equipment, the personal effects that families pack when they are not planning to return, and all of it was still in storage, because a Grade 4 detention file generated no disposal orders once it passed the initial processing stage. Nobody had decided what to do with the cargo because nobody with authority to decide had thought about it again. The colonists were in temporary residential codes. 4 years in, the administration at Verath 7 had quietly reclassified their status from detention to extended hold, because the paperwork for extended hold was easier to maintain, and the distinction made no practical difference to anyone. It made a difference to the people in it. A woman named Sira, who had been 31 when the patrol stopped her ship and was 44 now, had spent 13 years in a processing station designed for transit stays of under 8 weeks. She had learned enough Karath standard to navigate the administrative forms. She had a daughter who had not been born yet when they left for the new colony, and who was therefore 11 years old and had spent her entire life in temporary residential codes in a system none of them had asked to be in. The daughter's name was Kemi. She did not remember the ship. She had been told about it the way children are told about places they were too young to see. The release order came through at hour 37. It took the remaining 23 hours to process the paperwork, which was the kind of thing that happened when 13 years of administrative inertia had to be reversed by a sovereignty bureaucracy that was good at its procedures and not fast at departing from them. But it happened. The cargo was released from storage. The manifests were checked against the original intake records. Nothing was missing, a fact that said less about Karath generosity than about Grade 4 files generating no disposal orders once they passed initial processing. The ships were returned to the bay. The engines were checked by a Karath maintenance team and confirmed operational. The colonists were told in a form letter in Karath standard that their transit hold had been resolved and they were free to depart. Sira read the letter twice, then she went to find Kemi. At hour 54, the last of them were aboard. The bay doors opened. 14 ships moved out of Verath 7 for the first time in 13 years, undamaged, carrying everything they had arrived with. At 54 hours and 17 minutes, the restoration codes arrived. On 847 Karath warships, the drives answered their crews again. Not gradually, not with a warm-up sequence, not with any indication that anything unusual had occurred in the drive core architecture. They simply answered. The command protocols resumed. Every diagnostic returned nominal. Every system indicator came back clean. Exactly as promised. Exactly as promised, no more. The drives worked, the colonists were home, the transit rights were on record. Okonkwo was at her desk in the building that did not exist when the confirmation came through. She read it. She set the paper down. She picked up the cup of tea she had made 13 years ago and never quite finished and made herself another one, and this time she drank it. She did not celebrate. She did not call anyone. She updated the second ledger, the one without page numbers, with a final entry, the date and the time and the outcome in 3 plain lines, and then she closed it for the last time. Voncourt filed his incident report at the end of the 61st hour. The report was formal, thorough, and written in the third person, the way sovereignty incident reports always were. It covered the timeline of events, the nature of the Stillwater architecture, the contract records, the compliance sequence. It was accurate. It contained every relevant fact in the order a reviewer would need to understand what had happened. The personal notation field at the end, the one visible only to the Fleet Sovereign's office, not included in conclave-filed copies, was 6 words. We had no category for them. That was our error. He filed it. He closed the report. He did not add anything else because there was nothing else that was accurate to add. The Interstellar Conclave removed humanity from the developing world's registry 11 days after the terms were met. No species had requested the review. The registry committee had looked at the full file, which now included the Stillwater documentation and the contract records and the compliance timeline, and concluded without a formal vote that the category no longer applied. They sent a notification to the Terran Strategic Council. It was not an apology. It was an administrative update. Ademi, who had been waiting in the Conclave's outer offices for 13 years, received the notification on a Tuesday morning. He read it. He forwarded it to Okonkwo with no message attached. She forwarded it to Fadu, who filed it in the correct cabinet, because Fadu filed everything in the correct cabinet, and because a building that officially did not exist still needed its records kept straight. The framed broadcast came down from Okonkwo's desk the following week. She did not throw it away. She put it in a flat storage case and labeled the case with a date, not the date of the broadcast, but the date of the confirmation, and filed it with Fadu. It had been useful. It was done being useful. That was all. 40 years later, the standard curriculum at the Karath Naval Officers Academy included a primer on fleet doctrine. The primer ran to several hundred pages. It covered strategy, supply chains, engagement protocols, procurement standards, species classification systems, and the history of sovereignty military practice across 6,000 years of command. Under the heading Procurement Risk, Unclassified Species, there was a single advisory entry. It had been added to the curriculum 38 years prior, following a formal review of the Talon incident by the Sovereignty's Doctrine Commission. It had not been amended since. The entry read, "Do not assume you know what they have already built." It was not a warning about weapons. Any officer who read it looking for a weapons advisory was reading it wrong. It was a warning about columns, about what you stop auditing when you decide something is beneath notice, about the variable you leave out of the math because you decided before you looked that it was not worth finding, about the thing that sits in the layer below, waiting as long as it needs to, in the manifest you signed and filed and never opened again. The entry did not name humanity. It did not need to. In the Academy's library, in the reference section, there was a copy of the original Karath procurement manifest from the Talon contract period. It was available to any officer who wanted to read it. Most did not, because most officers had other things to do. But the ones who did read it found, on page 3, an entry filed 11 years before the incident under Grade 4 approved routine. Drive alignment calibration subcontractors, uncertified species, Grade 4 irrelevant. The entry had not been changed. Nobody had corrected it or annotated it or flagged it for reclassification. It was exactly what Telnhavar had typed on a Friday afternoon and filed without a second thought, and it would remain exactly that in the record for as long as the record lasted. The line below it, added to the manifest index 40 years later by the Doctrine Commission, read, "See Procurement Risk, Unclassified Species. Do not assume you know what they have already built."